Hello, and welcome to part one of your session 7 lecture on traditional medicine in the Americas. So we'll start off as usual with our session aims. Today we are really looking to cover the historical and cultural context of all of the indigenous major cultures across the Americas. So we're going to have a larger focus on North American native culture and medicine than perhaps some of the other ones, simply because more is known and documented about that, and there's been more of a continuous history perhaps that's been focused on in those civilizations. But we will also cover Central and South America as well as the Arctic Circle, and looking at the culture and worldviews as well as the medicine practices of those cultures. So here's a map of the Americas, and I'll just note I'm in the middle of a major windstorm right now, so if you hear funny noises, it means the trees in the wind are having a big tussle outside at the moment. So going back to our map here, so here we have a map of what we'll be covering in this lecture today. And just noting that when we talk about the United States, and in this lecture, we're talking about this area in the continental United States, as well as the area of Alaska up to the north. And you'll note that that connects to Russia right there, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And we're leaving out of the United States at this point in time Hawaii, because we covered that in the Pacific Islands. So the area of North America proper covers the area of Canada, the United States, and Mexico, although Mexico is often grouped with Central America, and Central America is that skinny bit that connects North and South America. Mexico is sometimes grouped together because the cultures are more similar, and that's called Middle America, so you'll hear those terms used interchangeably. And then South America is the larger continent. You'll note that Ecuador there in purple, that is where the equator moves through South America to help orient you geographically. And if you were to travel directly east from Brazil, you would eventually run into Africa. So one thing to note as we talk about the ancient Americas, the name America obviously wasn't established until sometime later than we're talking about at this point in time on this slide. And we'll talk about when that occurred in terms of with colonization here shortly. But about 12,000 years ago, North America and Asia were connected at that point of where Russia was up the top near Alaska. And it is thought that migrations of people from Asia across into the very far northern parts of North America in the Arctic Circle occurred around 9500 BCE, before the Common Era. And there has been now some archaeological evidence that seems to be calling that timing into question, or calling into question a belief that there may have been people existent on that continent earlier than that point in time when those migrations did occur. So the archaeological record is changing our perspective on things regularly as new things are discovered, and that's what's so awesome about archaeology. So around 1000 BCE, there was a shift towards horticulture and domestication of animals. And if you remember from our lecture on Stone Age and slightly after that, we saw the shift to farming and domestication of animals happen significantly earlier in the Middle East and in Europe, and this was happening significantly later in the Americas. So that's important to note, that the Americas were running slightly behind, not slightly, thousands of years behind the more eastern populations, and those populations having been perhaps established longer. It's worth noting that maize was grown in Mexico since about 5000 BCE. That is native to Mexico and that area. And it appears that it came to North America about 1200 BCE. And we now know that maize, or corn, that's pictured here, this is a wild variety of maize in this picture. Domesticated corn tends to be solid yellow, as we know now. That is a major staple crop in North America, staple grain crop. So it came from Mexico. Then we come to the European exploration of the Americas, and that's how they got the name the Americas. So we started off with Columbus coming from Spain to the Americas in 1492. In 1497, the first English explorer arrived on the American continent, and in 1604, Nova Scotia, which is the far northeast side of Canada, was found by the French, and that's relatively close to Europe in terms of distance traveled, much closer to Europe than the places where Columbus landed. Then in the 1500s, 1531 and 32, there was a Spanish expedition to Mexico and Peru. And that expedition focused on wealthy Aztec and Incan empires that had been found by Columbus earlier. And those were empires that were seen to be worthy of really exploitation, whether that word was used or not, because of how wealthy they were. And those expeditions resulted in really the stamping out of indigenous nations of Mexico and Peru. And then after that, the Spanish turned to North America and began to colonize more in North America. So the portrait here on our slide is said to be a posthumous painting of Christopher Columbus. There are no known authentic portraits of this man, and so we don't know how good of a likeness this is to him. But he was obviously the explorer that was primarily responsible for the colonization of Central and North America. By the 17th century, the English began to establish settlements in North America, and in 1718, the French settled New Orleans. And you can still see at this point in time in the US the cultural difference between the areas that were settled by English, Scottish, Irish, etc. Migrants that were predominant at that time, and the settlements that came in from the French source, because New Orleans and Louisiana as a whole is still quite a French culture. So when we get to European history a bit later in the semester, we're going to revisit there's this overlapping aspect of history with attention to the devastating impacts that there were of exploration and conquest and colonization on native people in the Americas and elsewhere. And that's really part of both European culture and these native cultures. We don't want to distract too much from the native cultures that we are exploring today in terms of spending too much time focusing on after they were disrupted. We want to know more about what their native practices and worldviews are, and so that's what we'll focus on today. But it's really important to note at this point in time that European exploration of the Americas was hugely destructive to these cultures and really came close to wiping some of them out and completely wiped some of them out. And there were wide-ranging impacts, both from the novel diseases that were brought by the Europeans that these native people had never been exposed to, and it just decimated their populations, like the flu and smallpox. And this had a huge impact on world history and world health over time. And we have to think about what would the world look like at this point in time if these native cultures hadn't been decimated by European exploration. So for now, we'll focus on establishing our understanding of their traditional forms of medicine and their traditional cultures and spirituality, and so that we can learn about these native cultures. So we're going to start from the north and travel south. And in our exploration, we've got two broad groupings of indigenous people in the Americas. There are the Arctic cultures, which include Alaska and the Arctic Circle in Canada, or the Arctic portion of Canada. And the image here, we've got Native North American tribal chiefs. So this is coming further south, right? The other broad grouping is the people that are often referred to as American Indians. They were referred to as Indians by Columbus and the explorers that came after Columbus, because his original intention or original vision was to reach the East Indies, what we know as India now, by traveling west from Europe, and he ran into North America before he got there. But he likewise called these people Indians, and that's really a misnomer for who they are. And within the grouping of Native American indigenous people, we have North American, including the southern part of Canada, the non-Arctic part of Canada, and all of the US, aside from Alaska. Then we have Middle America, the Mexican and Central American regions of Native cultures, and then we have South American Native cultures. So the picture here, as I said, is it's almost 400 years after the original exploration of the Americas. In 1865, this photo was taken of a group of Native North American tribal chiefs. So we'll start off in the north in the Arctic Circle with the Inuit people and Eskimo people. So in the Arctic Circle, we're talking about Alaska and Canada. These are cultures that are significantly different than probably any cultures than we see elsewhere on Earth, except for perhaps the native Siberian people who had some likeness to these. So the Eskimos are made up of the Inuit and Yupik and Aleut nations, and they live in a climate of extremely harsh and long winters that are dark, very dark all winter long, and very long summer hours, almost 24 hours in some places further north, actual 24-hour daylight, and never getting any true darkness throughout those summer hours. So those long summer hours mean that the vegetation becomes quite lush during that time, and that draws many herds of caribou and other animals to come to those areas of more lush vegetation in the long summer hours, which allows for hunting. And that is the backbone of their diet. So we have the Native Alaskan groups often like to be called Native Alaskans rather than being called Native Americans, and the Canadian Arctic people really preferring to be called Inuit. In Canada, the further south, the nations further south prefer to be called First Nations people. And so there are different preferences among these tribal people or these ancient cultures in terms of how they relate to our culture now and how they like to be related to. So the backbone of their society is bands of people based on kinship and marriage. And of course, because of the need to mix up the genetic pool, there is communication between these bands of kinship and marriage, or has been over time, as well as over time now likely interaction with other cultures that are now living nearby. But at the time of the development of these cultures, they were relatively isolated. The diet of the Inuit people tends to be very focused on animal fat and animal protein. And so they have a much, much higher content of fat and protein in their diet and a lower content of carbohydrate. And their bodies are adapted to this. And so they would not do well if they went on to a higher carbohydrate diet, just as we likely, having not been adapted to that, would not adapt well to eating the diet that they eat. They eat a lot of seal meat, which includes a lot of blubber from the seals, as well as whales, and I mentioned caribou and other mammals that live further north. Very high content of omega-3 fat in their diet, and there's been a fair amount of research now on how their bodies are adaptive to this diet, which the rest of us really wouldn't be able to live on. So it's a very specialized diet that they've got. The photo here is of a Inupiat family in 1929. So this is a little bit later than we're talking about in terms of the ancient cultures. The Inuit spirituality is very grounded in the belief that what's called an anua, which we would call soul, exists in all people and animals. So we can see a distinct difference here between what we might say modern religion might relate to in terms of the animals having a soul. And families, individuals, and bands will follow a really complex system of taboos to ensure that animals continue to make themselves available to hunters. So this is very important because these cultures depend entirely upon the availability of animals at suitable times of the year in order for hunting to take place to provide their diet. They don't have a lot of access to edible vegetation, and so they don't get much in terms of carbohydrate or an energy source from other places, and animal fat is the main source of their energy. And so their spirituality calls for having a lot of traditions that surround connecting with the animals in nature and making sure that they maintain the relationship and that the animal population is not depleted. They also have rituals and ceremonies that are performed before and after hunting to assure that the success of hunting. And we see this in other Native American cultures as well. A very close spiritual connection to animal life and a great respect of animal life, with nothing being wasted from an animal, and making sure that the appropriate respect is paid to nature in order for nature to continue to sustain us. The Angakut is the spiritual leader of the band of people. So the Inuits, as I said, were in bands together, and their spiritual leader within each band is called the Angakut. And he would interpret the causes of sickness or lack of hunting success. And so if a sickness was present either in an individual or within the group more widely, something communicable perhaps, or if hunting was not bearing the fruit that it needed to bear in order for them to survive, he would interpret the reasons for that. And that would be a determination of whether, say, someone in the band or the band as a whole had broken any taboos or had failed to appropriately show reverence for the aspects of nature that are necessary for ensuring good hunting. And he would also enter into a trance through drumming and chanting in order to gain information about the types of causes of sickness or the lack of hunting success. And so again, this is a shamanistic form of medicine. It is allowing this person allowing essentially their soul to leave the body and to travel into different realms over great distances to determine the causes of various community problems. So that's a shamanistic approach to medicine or to spirituality. And we've seen that in prior lectures. We'll see that throughout the rest of this lecture and other lectures as well. So the image here is a photo of an Inukshuk, which is a stone cairn that's in the form of a person. And this is a cultural icon or a symbol of the Inuit. They build these cairns as representation of their culture and their symbology. And there are lots of cultures over time that have used cairns. The Celts are a very good example that often folks are a bit more familiar with. So from the Inuits, we're not going to move south into what's now the main part of Canada and the US. And we'll take the North American nations in regions. This is kind of an overwhelming amount of information on the next few slides, but it's here for your information because it is quite interesting. And it's important that we acknowledge that as we talk about North American culture, native culture in terms of Canada and the US, that we are not talking about a single culture. We're talking about a very, very broad and large number of native nations, some of which were often at war with each other, some of which were very peaceful, and had some very, very different cultural bases, and then had a lot of similar things as well. There was also a lot of communication amongst these tribes as people would intermarry between tribes or between nations, or in warfare, we would have people taken hostage as slaves, and oftentimes those people might end up creating children with people of the tribe that took them. And so we do have mixtures of bloodlines that happen through those methods as well. So it's important to keep that diversity in mind as we travel through this. And I'm not going to read through everything on these slides, but really just call out some of the important differences. So in the Southeast, this is the Southeast United States, what we would call the deep south of the U.S. For those of us who are from the U.S., this is where I'm from. And this area was predominantly agricultural. There were chiefdoms and hereditary classes within these nations, and they had a reliance on growing corn, beans, squash, and tobacco. All of these things are quite prevalent in American agriculture in that area of the country now, as well as things like cotton, for example, which was imported. They also hunted deer and fished. That region of, all of North America, really very, very heavily populated with large mammals, including deer. Deer being a very prevalent mammal in North America and a very prevalent source of meat. Also, lots of rivers and lakes in North America, and just really large amounts of fish at this point in time that we're talking about these native tribes when they inhabited these regions before the times of colonization and before the population density came in and depleted those resources. So moving to the plains are the central portion of North America, which includes places like Kansas and Oklahoma. So sort of the alley down the middle, what we call Hurricane Alley or Tornado Alley now. You can see the tribes that were prevalent there and that lived there. They had some similar material items amongst them, like use of teepees. A teepee is a cultural icon that is very recognized from Native Americans in general, but it is not something that was used across all Native American nations, so that's important to note. They also had tailored leather clothing, which we probably can imagine what that was like, as it may have been portrayed in movies that we've seen, as well as the typical feathered headdress and other battle regalia and drums. If you're interested in seeing what any of this looks like nowadays, you can go and Google Native American powwow on YouTube, and you can find videos of current Native American nations when they come together in their powwows, which they still do now. These are group meetings of amongst the First Nations people, and you can see some examples of how this Native American clothing and regalia has evolved over time. The southwest of the U.S., a very, very different climate than the southeast. It is predominantly high desert, and so we're talking about Southern California, Arizona, New Mexico, those areas around in there, including the western part of Texas. Their agriculture actually is quite different, considering how different the climate is. Quite similar, considering how different the climate is. With also corn, beans, and squash. You'll note that all of these are relatively high carbohydrate foods that were their agricultural products there. They got their protein from fish and from mammals that they hunted, buffalo, deer, etc. And they got their carbohydrate from these very starch-rich things that they cultivated. So the Native American nations in this area were actually quite distinct in many ways. There were the Pueblos that were made up of the Zunis and the Hopis. And the picture here is a picture of the Anasazi cliff dwellings, which were a Pueblo tribe in it's near what's called the Four Corners of the Southwest U.S. It's the only place where 4 U.S. states come together at a single point, and that is, New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, and Utah all come together at this point. And there's a national park there called Mesa Verde. You'll note that just above those cliff dwellings, there is what's called a mesa. It's a tabletop geological structure, and the plants on top of it. So perhaps that's where the name came from, Mesa Verde. Verde means green in Spanish. And these cliff dwellings were very, very complex, very large area, a place where these nations lived. If you look at the picture here, you can see, let's see if I can bring my pointer down here. This is a group of people who are touring that dwelling right now. there. And I've actually been here and walked through these myself when I was driving across the US once. It's absolutely phenomenal to walk through this canyon where these buildings are. And they say that at some points in time there were up to 30,000 people living within these cliff dwellings. And the way that the sound echoes through there is just amazing. So I can only imagine how loud it was if 30,000 people were living there at one time. And so the Pueblos lived in dwellings like these. Their culture involved dolls and dances. They created very fine pottery and textiles, as well as sand paintings, which are preserved in a lot of the national parks in those areas. There are a lot of ruins in this part of the country where you can go and visit the Pueblo ruins of the buildings that they built. So they weren't TP people. They were more into being stationary and not carrying their dwellings around on their back. The Navajo people, this was a very complex clan-based nation. They had a lot of healing rituals, a lot of fine textiles and jewelry as well. If you've ever been to the southwestern United States, you may be familiar that a lot of stones are mined there. There's a lot of complexity of the types of crystals and stones that are found in the ground in that part of the United States. And so that provided some of the basis for the jewelry there. Other tribes in the southwestern United States are the Apache, Yuman, Pima, and Papago, and they had a lot of cultural expression through oral traditions. So you can see some of the differences even in these regional areas within, relatively, I won't say small areas of the country, but areas where there was certainly possibility of these nations communicating with each other. Moving up now, we come up to the Great Basin, and this would be a further north area of the U.S. On the western side. For here we had the Mono, the Paiute, the Bannock, the Shoshone, Ute, Gosiote, and Washoe Indians, and they were mobile, probably due to climate, and they were kin-based. And they had some agriculture and products. There were the harvesting of seeds, small game. They produced nets for fishing, a lot of rock art and grinding stones there as well. And then the plateau, this is the further north portion of the Midwest, across North and South Dakota, Wisconsin area, Nebraska, etc. And you can see the tribes that were located there. They excelled in a lot of material innovation and adapting technologies for their own purposes. And so we've got these areas, these are sort of abutting each other, the Great Basin slightly to the east, to the west, and the plateau slightly to the east there, moving across the more northern area of North America and northern United States and southern Canada. The northwest coastal area, this is the very far Pacific Northwest of the U.S., where we think about Seattle and Portland at this point in time, and the tribes are listed there. The Chinook are probably the most well-known of those tribes and are most culturally visible in the Seattle area now. I used to live in the Seattle area, so I'm somewhat conversant with that. They had an abundant and reliable supply of salmon and other sea mammals and fish and a wide variety of plants. The Pacific Northwest of the United States is a temperate rainforest. It is green all year round. Some things will grow there all year round, and it doesn't freeze super frequently, so it does stay green. They're quite known for their fine wood and stone carvings and large watercraft, big canoes and other types of wooden watercraft, as well as totem poles and basketry. So you can look online if you want to see what some of their totems look like. They're beautiful carved monoliths of a time. Not lith is the wrong word because that means rock, but the large totems that they carved from the huge trees that grow in that area, and the ceremonial nature of those. Then we have the sort of more central part of California with the tribes that are listed there. And they used acorns to make flour. And so acorns generally consumed without any processing are quite toxic. And they have to go through a fair amount of processing in order to make them non-toxic for human consumption. It involves a lot of soaking and washing and grinding in order to bring the toxins out. And so they developed methods of that to serve as a source of carbohydrate in their diet for something that they didn't have to actually cultivate. And they're quite known for their basketry and a lot of trade fairs that were very ritualized. So that's the end of our first part of session 7. We have your revision questions here, which are also on your LMS, and a question there to provide some other food for thought based upon what you know from your own past or your own native place where you were born. What do you expect the effects of colonization were on indigenous health? And so I'll leave you with that question, and I will see you in part 2.